Good evening, everyone. My name is Bert Dicht. I'm Vice President of Membership for the National Space Society. And on behalf of Larry Ahern, Vice President of Chapters, I'd like to welcome you to our NS Space Forum. And tonight's topic, New Rides to the Moon with Dale Skran. I think you're going to enjoy it. So again, we thank you for joining us. We're doing these now every 2 weeks, alternating sometimes between the space forums and the town halls. So I'll be talking about what's coming up next shortly. As always, I'd like to go over a little bit of virtual etiquette with everybody. So please, when you want to submit a question, we do encourage you to use the Q&A function, because that's only seen by the panelists. When you put a question into the chat, it can get mixed up with all the other information there, like people commenting or posting some things and that type of thing. So it's best to use the Q&A function. You can use the chat function, but I do encourage you to be respectful of the panelists in the audience because everybody can see it. And we will, if we can, open up the mics to someone to ask a question over their phone. So we've done that in the past, and we hope to do that again tonight as the questions come in. There were a lot of questions submitted, but we're hoping to try to do a mixture of questions that were submitted and questions that we get tonight during the presentation. And I do encourage you, if you are using for the first time Zoom, put the session into speaker mode. That ensures that the speaker is highlighted. So again, thank you all for joining us. Let me go through the agenda real quick. I have a few announcements up front. I'd like to get these out of the way. Then we'll talk about what's coming up in terms of the town halls and space forums, and it'll only take a few minutes, and then we'll get right into our presentation. And then we'll thank everybody and close for the evening. So a few announcements, like I like to do every time. I do encourage you to check out NSS and the latest on space. Check out space.nss.org, our website, and especially our blogs that are actually updated frequently. If you haven't yet signed into InsideNSS.org, that is our membership portal, giving you control and to enhance your membership value. And of course, check us out on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. I will post these into the chat as the evening goes along, so you have them. Also, I do encourage you to give to our cause. If you support what we're doing, and I know you do because you're NSS members, and we thank you for that. But if you do enjoy the programming like these space forums and town halls, please make a donation to support what we're doing. And again, we've had people donate over the past few events, and I really want to thank everybody who's contributing. Everything counts, whether it's $5 or $25. So really appreciate it. As the event closes out, I will ask you to complete the post-town hall. Well, actually, tonight's the Space Forum survey. So please do the survey. It's anonymous. Just a few questions. It'll only take you a couple of minutes, and it'll really help us out. So let me just give you a kind of a glimpse of what's coming up next in terms of our town halls and space forums. 2 weeks from tonight, really interesting. We have an interview with Scott Pace, who is the former executive secretary of the National Space Council, and also an NSS member and officer in the past as well. And that's going to be hosted by Greg Autry, a member of our board of directors. So don't miss this informative discussion about what's happening with space policy and what happened with the previous administration related to space. Upcoming, we've got on the 22nd a space law students panel moderated by our new president, Michelle Hanlon. And right after that, on the 6th, we have an early career aerospace professionals panel moderated by Chantel Beyer. I really encourage you to participate in both of those. These are going to showcase some of the early career professionals that we have that are part of NSS. So please, if you can, take a look at that. One will be on space law. The other will be on just what it's like to be an early career professional in the aerospace industry. We're working to finalize the May 22nd event, the May 20th event. Then we're looking at, I know it might be tentative, an awards presentation on the 3rd, then a preview of our virtual International Space Development Conference, which will come up on the 24th to the 27th. That will occur on June 17th. So a lot of great things coming up for you. You can check out space.nss.org/NSS-space-forums right on the NSS website. All of the recordings are also there that you can find from previous events. And as I mentioned before, we're adding more and more as we move along. So that's it with the announcements. Now time to talk about this evening's program. And again, I do want to welcome our NSS Senior Vice President and Senior Operating Officer, Dale Skran. You have seen his bio in the invite and on the website. Dale has an impressive background in IT and has been a really incredibly dedicated member and officer of NSS. I've come to know him as a great colleague, and tonight you're going to hear some of his expertise on what's happening in space. So we're really looking forward to new rides to the moon, a review of current and upcoming vehicles that will carry humanity back to the moon. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn this over to Dale. So Dale, it is all yours.
Hello, everybody. As I've already been introduced by the most excellent Bert Dick. Thank you, Bert. I'm not going to add anything to that. I'm just going to get right into it. But Bert, I'm going to share my screen, and I want to just confirm that everybody can hear me and that everything is good to go. So, Bert, are we okay? Can you see the screen and everything?
It looks good right now, Dale. We hear you well, and your slide is showing up on the screen, so you're good to go.
Okay, this is like launching a rocket. You have to have a countdown. So, well, welcome, everybody. I said in the intro, we're going to get the geek on, and I'm going to try to introduce this to a general audience. But as I worked on these slides, I've just reminded that practically every single thing in this talk, I could do another talk of 40 or 50 slides, which is kind of a scary thought. Anyway, let's get into it. So, Bert, could you confirm that the slides advanced?
They are good to go, Dale. I'll let you know if you run into any trouble. Yep.
Okay. So what we're going to do in this talk is we're going to take a look at rockets. This is going to focus on rockets that launch from the Earth and go to the moon. It's not going to focus on lunar landers. There could be another talk on lunar landers, and I saw some questions about that, but we're not going to talk about lunar landers today. And we're going to talk about rockets that are either available now or planned for the next 5 years, and that are likely to actually be part of a return to the moon. Serious, well-funded projects, not things like the Delta IV and Atlas V, which are in their own way excellent rockets, but they're not going to be most likely used in going back to the moon. And I also made a decision to cut the Ariane 6 out of the talk to make it a little shorter, and because it's becoming clear that the Ariane 6 is not very competitive compared to the other rockets, it's probably going to be replaced by the Ariane 7 really quickly. Also, there have been some very recent exciting announcements of the Rocket Lab Neutron, which is a really interesting rocket, and China's Long March 8 and Long March 9, which is really, really big. But these are so new and there's so little information, I didn't think it made sense to put them in a talk. So let's going on to the next page, which is called Jibber Jabber. And when I was preparing to do this, I said, you know, there's certain acronyms that you really need to understand, or this is just a gobbledygook talk. And I'm going to go through them, and you know, this is the part of the geek aspect of the talk. So there's low Earth orbit. I think people know what LEO stands for. Many people anyway. Heinlein famously said it was halfway to anywhere. I noticed there were some specific talks about the exact energy to go from different orbits. I decided not to go into that. That's a whole nother level of geek. And the reason I didn't is because it's really complicated. You could do a whole talk just on the energy to get from different orbits and so on. The second orbit is geosynchronous transfer orbit. I call it the road to geo. You should know, if you don't, that satellites are only rarely launched directly to geo. So typically they're launched to GPO, and then they have ion engines in a modern system to get all the way up to geo. And there's geosynchronous orbit, which is a bit further than halfway to anywhere. And that's where all the big comsats are. It's the most commercially significant orbit right now. And then a little bit further out, we have, or a little bit higher energy to be more accurate, we have translunar injection, which is the road to the moon, and that's just a bit more than GEO. I know that some of you might be frustrated by terms like just a bit more, but like I say, general audience. And then, of course, there's net, no earlier than, the soonest the rocket will launch. So just wanted to get that out of the way. So let's go on here. These are the contenders. I'm not going to read the list. We're going to go through them all in a lot of detail. I'm just going to move on here. But first, before we do the contenders, we're going to do a little background. So what is the sweet spot for commercial launch? It turns out that most geosynchronous concepts weigh less than 9 metric tons. And the Ariane 5 ECA, which stands for Evolution Cryotechnique Type A, which is the current operating version, and you see the picture of it over to the right, in its day, which was more like 10 years ago, was a really, really great solution. You could take 2 satellites, a small one and a big one, as it says here, like a 3 metric ton and a 9 metric ton, and put them on the same rocket and launch them for about $150 million. And that was sufficient to allow Arianespace to own the commercial space launch market. And this rocket has an architecture that is sometimes called a build-a-rocket architecture, similar to the Atlas V. I'm going to explain what build-a-rocket is so you can appreciate how the technology is evolving. The Atlas V is the quintessential build-a-rocket. It typically has multiple solid fuel boosters, low-energy hydrocarbon first stage, it's sort of kerosene, oxygen, and a high-energy hydrogen and oxygen upper stage. Now, there are all sorts of rockets that slightly vary. Sometimes the SRBs are replaced by liquid fuel boosters. Sometimes the lower stage is hydrogen, oxygen, but they're all build-a-rocket designs. And the general notion here is that by combining different upper stages and different numbers of solid fuel boosters, you can have different launch capacities. I was really surprised at one point to learn that the Atlas V can be launched with 1 solid booster. You'd think it would fall over, but it doesn't. It's really quite amazing to watch one of those launches. Anyway, we're going to go on to the next slide. So what happened then? Along came SpaceX and the Falcon 9, and it rained on the Ariane 5 parade. I mean, it basically just sort of took over the commercial launch market. And the reason for this is that customers hated waiting for a matchup. And so SpaceX said, well, okay, no matchup. We're going to have a rocket that only launches 1 satellite. And as it turns out, in a reusable mode, the Falcon 9 can launch most of the geosynchronous ComSats. And in expendable mode, it can launch almost all of them. And it's a lot cheaper than the Ariane 5. It's like 62 million list for lifting 5.5 metric tons to geosynchronous transfer orbit with a reusable first stage. And that price heading down, possibly as low as $36 million. So this is a really big deal. And it as I say here, it's the unbuilder rocket. It's a way of varying launch capacity with a different architecture. And the different architecture is to have 3 modes. And you can see them illustrated on the right. The first one is expendable. The second one is sea landing, where the first stage lands on a barge at sea. They don't like to call it a barge, they call it a drone ship. And the third way, which is the least capacity, is the first stage flies back to the launch site. And it's just a revolution. I mean, it's led to a situation where SpaceX has dramatically lower costs and has, I think at this point, just totally upended the launch market. So now we're going to look at the competitors. What are the competitors to go back to the moon? I call these the first 3. I'm a little bit inspired by March Madness here. They're the rockets that are operational or close to it. Anyway, I guess you're never supposed to apologize in a speech. I could criticize the way I've organized these things. But I tried to do it in a way that would be easier to present and easier to understand. So let's take a look at the Long March 5, the Falcon Heavy, and SLS Block 1. The Long March 5 is the sort of leading Chinese rocket. It put rovers on the moon. It had a few problems a couple years back. They lost one of them. but it's operational now, and we can expect that it's going to be launching this year, basically, their space station, a Mir-class space station. So it's their workhorse, and we'll look at it in a little more detail in a bit. The second one we're looking at is the Falcon Heavy. I think you're all familiar with it. It's put Elon Musk's red Tesla Roadster on Mars. It's flown 3 times, I believe, and there are 2 more launches scheduled for this year. It has a pretty full manifest, and you can see there in the upper right the two the 2 side boosters returning to launch site. Now, as it so happens, they've never successfully returned the center core. It failed twice, and once it actually landed, but then a storm came along and it tipped over, and it never made it back to port. But I think it's fair to say this is an operational vehicle. And then the third contender in this class is SLS Block 1. I think the thing that someone might criticize is the other 2 are operational. This is sort of almost operational. And I think it's advanced enough. They just had a successful green run test. It's fair to make this comparison. It's an example of what's called a build-a-rocket architecture. We have solid boosters, but it's a really big rocket. And I'll mention this. This is sort of like something people don't think about much, but when you use hydrogen and oxygen as the fuels, you have the highest thrust, the highest specific impulse, not the highest thrust, the highest specific impulse. But it's a big rocket because hydrogen is not very dense. And a big rocket tends to be more expensive and complex. And this is indeed a really big rocket. So now let's take a look at comparing these. So I have this eye chart here. You'll see on the left the areas of comparison, and then Long March, Falcon Heavy, SLS Block 5. And then up here in the right, I point out that Saturn V had a liftoff thrust of 34.8 meganewtons. I'm just going to say apologies to the English system, but I went all metric on this one, and all the thrusts are in meganewtons. I don't think my intuition on meganewtons is that good, but it just seems like the right way to do it. Let's just take a look at these things. So I have these nice little graphic things to call your attention to different things, so it's hopefully easy to understand. The SLS Block 1, definitely the biggest of these 3 rockets, and it also the most thrust. It is actually a bit more takeoff thrust than the Saturn V, although because the upper stages are weaker, it actually underperforms the Saturn V. From a fairing point of view, perhaps a little surprisingly, the Falcon Heavy comes out ahead, in part because they've announced that they're doing a bigger fairing that's 18.6 meters tall. Now, fairings are not the final bell here or anything, because you can always usually make a little bigger fairing on a rocket up to a point anyway. Turns out the LEO payload of the Falcon Heavy and the SLS Block 1 actually very similar. Much more similar than you might think. And that, of course, this is both in expendable mode. And note that there's a reusable mode capacity for the Falcon Heavy that's 23 metric tons, quite a bit less. Next thing we'll take a look at is the trans-lunar injection payload. And what you'll see there is that the winner is clearly SLS Block 1. The next area of to look at is reusability, and clearly the Falcon Heavy is the leader here. It's totally reusable except for the second stage. Okay, you can reuse the side boosters, reuse the center core, reuse the fairings. Just that second stage is not reusable, and that's a big advantage. Of course, Falcon Heavy, Long March 5, definitely operational. The expectation, as it says here, is that the SLS Block 1 will launch net November 2021. Wouldn't be terribly surprised to see it slip a little bit, but I don't expect it to slip very much from that. So now we're going to look at what I call the fast followers, which really doesn't connect to March Madness. I think more it connects to the ambition of the New Glenn to be the fast follower to Falcon Heavy. And they're more or less targeted for 2022 plus. So we're going to, okay, one of them is the New Glenn, and I have this chart here to help you understand the different sizes the Ariane 6 is surprisingly, I'm sorry, Ariane 5 is surprisingly small compared to the other rockets. The Vulcan's perhaps a little bit bigger. Vulcan Heavy, basically the same size as the Vulcan. And then, of course, the New Glenn, which is really big, almost the size of the Saturn V. And that, as it turns out, is because they have hydrogen and oxygen upper stages that are really big. The Vulcan's another rocket in this fast follower class. It's going to be launching U.S. military payloads because we're at 40% of the national of the U.S. Space Force launch. I'm sorry, 60% of the U.S. Space Force contract. But they also have commercial launches, including quite a number of Sierra Nevada Dream Chaser cargo launches to the ISS. This is the pure, the next generation builder rocket. They've taken the Atlas V and they've done everything a little bit better. And the notable thing about this is that this actually uses the same engine as the New Glenn and methane oxygen fuel, but it has a hydrogen oxygen upper stage, and it has some new, more powerful solid rocket boosters. And then, of course, there's the SLS. And the part of the SLS we want to focus on is the evolution here. It's called the SLS Block 1B. We've already talked about the SLS Block 1. And the difference between the Block 1 and the Block 1B is what's called the exploration upper stage, which is a larger upper stage that's more powerful, has more fuel. The upper stage for SLS Block 1 is actually exactly the same as the upper stage on the Delta IV. So it's really way underpowered for the first stage of the SLS. And the intention here with the SLS Block 1B is to correct that. I'm not going to talk about the SLS Block 2 because it is probably outside the time frame of this talk, which is sort of the next 5 years. It would have enhanced cargo capacity due to better solid rocket boosters. Okay, so now we got another one of those dreadful eye charts. It's the same thing. We got the area of comparison on the left, New Glenn, Vulcan with 6 SRBs and SLS Block 1, and the little yellow cheat sheet to remind you what was going on with the Saturn V. And I just want to point out that this is the most capable version of the Vulcan with 6 solid rocket boosters. That's a lot of solid rocket boosters. So let's watch the red, and you'll see again the SLS Block 1 is definitely the biggest of these 3 rockets, and it definitely has the biggest liftoff thrust. Again, somewhat more than the Saturn V. And compared to these two, probably, SLS is definitely the winner, but I do want to point out that the New Glenn has a very large fairing, a 7-meter diameter fairing. It's intended to sort of push the market and to be significantly better than vehicles like the Vulcan or the Vulcan Heavy, which are in the sort of a 5-meter fairing diameter. And then, of course, payload to LEO, SLS Block 1 is the winner. But I will point out that you have to be a little careful about this. Nobody really knows what the expendable capacity of the New Glenn is. It is certainly possible. It is certainly much more than 45 metric tons. How much more? Nobody really knows. But it could be close to 105 metric tons. From the translunar injection payload orbit, definitely SLS Block 1 is the winner, and with a 37 to 40 metric ton range. It's not surprising because it was specifically designed to be good at this. In terms of availability or readiness, the Vulcan is coming, scheduled for October of this year. Now, there was a question. I'm going to answer it right now. And someone asked, when is the next rocket to the moon, going to the moon? I believe, I could be wrong, I believe it will be this launch. Certainly the next American rocket going to the moon. The Peregrine lunar lander will be the first flight of the Vulcan, and then it will be followed by some U.S. Space Force launches next year, and then next year the first Dream Chaser launch, which will be extremely exciting to see. That's worth a whole nother talk in itself, because now we'll be able to fly to the ISS and land on a winged vehicle that with a very gentle ride. So that's going to be super exciting, but that's a different talk. Reusability, New Glen's the winner. The whole first stage is supposed to be reusable. The Vulcan supposedly will have the ability to drop the engines and have them picked up by a helicopter. I don't really expect to see that for a while. So that's the comparison of these things. I do want to emphasize that both New Glenn and Vulcan have a really pretty significant a number of cargoes in their manifest. They definitely look like they're going to be in pretty good shape in there, right? Now I'm going to do a more detailed comparison of what I would think the most likely vehicles that are actually going to go to the moon in the next few years. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just interrupt for a second? It sounds like there's some feedback coming from your microphone. Because everyone else is muted. Can you just double check that? Because we're getting some kind of static. I don't know. Everyone else.
Tell you what, I'm gonna. Is this any better?
Let's see. Yep. Try it again. Try talking again. Yep.
Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3.
That sounds better. Let's go with that. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. That's the job. So I apologize for this, but I wanted to make the text big enough so somebody could see it. So I didn't put in the areas of comparison, which are listed up front. So we have here liftoff thrust, fairing size, LEO capacity, translunar injection capacity, first launch, and reusability. And I'm just going to take you through this. SLS Block 1, clearly the thrust victor. New Glenn, at least comparing. Now remember, we're comparing this to the SLS Block 1, not Block 1B. New Glenn definitely is the winner on the fairing. SLS Block 1 and Falcon Heavy, as I said, also really close together. I think practically probably doesn't make that much difference. And you can tell that this is the case because NASA has signed a contract with SpaceX to launch the first 2 gateway components on a single Falcon Heavy. And they've also have a contract with SpaceX to use the Falcon Heavy to send logistics modules to the gateway, which indicates it may not be quite at the SLS Block 1B, a Block 1 level, but it's close. Clearly, the SLS Block 1 is either the leader, it's probably the leader here, and we don't know. I don't think it's ever been publicly said what the TLI capacity of the Falcon Heavy is, but it's, as you can say here, it's less than 37 or 27 metric tons, which is, why is it, okay, it's less than 27 metric tons, which is what you can launch to LEO, but it's more than what this 16.8 metric tons is what the Falcon Heavy can launch to Mars. It's more to that, so it's somewhere in between there. Certainly less than SLS Block 1, but comparable. And then, of course, in reusability, again, Falcon Heavy, clear winner. Also, Falcon Heavy, probably similar to New Glenn in reusability. So facially, SLS wins, but when you consider cost, Falcon Heavy or New Glenn are way, way ahead, and not by a little bit in terms of cost. But you know, this has never really been about cost. There's a philosophy issue here. Some people believe in the big rocket. Other people believe in in-space assembly and refueling. And the people that building the SLS believe in the big rocket. And that's just, it's a philosophy. And you know, that you could argue that both ways. So a couple of questions before we move on to the next segment of this. Inquiring minds want to know, why is New Glenn so big? And I think you've figured it out by now. It's the hydrolox stage. It's really big. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a better rocket. It just means it's using hydrogen as fuel for the upper stage. Then I think the real question is, why does the Falcon Heavy do so well and not use hydrolox? Because the Falcon Heavy is all RP1, rocket propeller 1, which is just refined kerosene. So the answer is really 2 things. The Merlin 1D engines in the Falcon has the highest thrust to weight ratio of any engine ever flown, period. So it's a very impressive engine. and also the subcooled fuel. They make the fuel extra cold. When the fuel is extra cold, you can get more fuel in the same size rocket. It's like a cheat. It's never been done operationally before SpaceX, and they went through a lot of hoops to persuade NASA to do it, even on crewed flights. But it gives you an extra couple percent, and an extra couple percent turns out to matter quite a bit. But this isn't the whole story, okay? There's more to it. And the more to it is the SpaceX Starship. I've given this talk 2 times before, and I didn't have all these cool SpaceX Starship pictures when I gave it. But now we do. So you can see the Starship leaping forward, powered by 3 Raptors. So I'm gonna kind of go through this. So what is this all about? I mean, even though many people know about Starship, I'm convinced that many people haven't really thought through what's going on and what it means. SpaceX is building a new rocket to replace the Falcon 9 and the Falcon Heavy. This is really bold. It's like playing poker and taking all your money and putting it on one hand of cards. They're way ahead now. They could rest on their laurels and just milk the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy for profits, but they're not doing it. They're scrapping the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy and replacing it with a shiny new rocket. It's legendary. But the really amazing thing is that we can watch in real time, because it's all being done in an open field where fans can line the roads and take pictures, which I don't know has ever happened. Not to my recollection. So I'm going to take you through some of the test events we've had recently. August 27th, 2019, we had a Starhopper 150-meter test flight. And, the Starhopper is sort of a precursor. It has a single Raptor engine, rigid legs, and sometimes called the flying water tank. And it flew a couple times, and it basically worked reasonably well, although maybe a few parts flew off at various points. On August 4th, 2020, we had Starship serial number 5, sometimes called the flying grain silo with a single Raptor. And I just have to say, I'm gobsmacked by these pictures, because you wouldn't think that this thing could actually fly. It looks like a toy or something in a machine shop, not a rocket. And the thing at the top, this odd-looking square gizmo, is what's called a mass simulator. It simulates the upper part, the cargo part of the rocket. But and the other thing I want to point out about this is that, remember, this is a methane LOX engine. I'm going to talk a little more about this later. But you notice that there are these little white things. These are called mock diamonds, and they're characteristic of methane rocket engines. Anyway, we had on September 3rd, Starship SN6, another flight, and another amazing picture that you really think has to be some kind of CGI, except it's great CGI. Moving up to December 9th, 2020, getting close to the modern day, we had Starship serial number SN8 with 3 Raptor engines. It went up, it flipped around, it fired its engines, and it didn't quite make it. So, moving on February 2nd of this year, 2021, we had SN9. It basically did the same thing as SN8 did, but the thing I think was super cool about this is shown in this picture, is that while they were getting ready to launch SN9, SN10 was waiting. And this is something out of science fiction. Yeah, I'm sure it's happened before on some military bases, maybe in the 60s. But the idea that the rockets are just lined up waiting to fly, it's like an illustration from an old science fiction magazine. On SN10 flew on March 3rd, 2021. We had a similar profile, but with better pictures. Up, flip over, try to land, actually land, but not quite success, because after about 8 minutes, something happened and it blew up. Probably that it just hit a little too hard, and some of the legs didn't. Something happened. Let's put it that way. Anyway, the thing is just, okay, this is cool and all, but it's just a rocket, right? I mean, some guys are flying a rocket, it keeps blowing up. Who really cares? So what is the big deal about it? And I want to go through this. I originally had this all on one slide, but I said nobody can understand that slide because the print is like 8 points or something, and it really gives short shrift to the Starship. This is the first ever fully reusable space vehicle, at least in intention. Now, it may fail, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's designed to be. It uses subcooled methane and LOX, which has never been done before in a flying vehicle. It has something called a full flow stage combustion engine, which has never been done before in a flying vehicle. I'm going to say Everyday Astronaut has a great explanation of what this engine is. He has about an hour or so lecture explaining what a full flow stage combustion engine is, but it's really innovative. And I think the thing to take away from this part of my talk is that in the past, a lot of people criticize SpaceX for like using old technology and this and that. And you could say that Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy are like really amazing implementations of stuff that people already knew, but somehow failed to take full advantage of. That's not true with Starship Super Heavy. Starship Super Heavy is like nothing that's ever flown before. Of course, the design uses in-space refueling, and if this works, you won't get 100 metric tons to LEO. You'll get 100 metric tons to Mars and the Moon, which is a big deal. Moving on to the second page here, those funny wings you see on Starship there's no aircraft, no rocket has ever been flown using those aero control systems. It's designed to control itself the way a skydiver controls themselves when they use their hands to maneuver in the air. And it's pretty remarkable. And again, that alone we probably talk 15 or 20 minutes to just explain what those aero surfaces really do. It has low-cost steel construction. A lot of rockets in the 60s, like the early Atlas, did use steel. But it's not really the stainless steel that's truly unique, although it does have advantages. It's more that Elon has set out to build a rocket production line, not to build a rocket. And his goal is to build thousands of these things, not to build two. And that's why he's basically producing like one every couple of weeks, and that's pretty crazy. If it succeeds, it will slash all previous cost records, and pretty much everything we want to do will become possible. The 9-meter diameter cargo section is really big, and it pretty much leads the field. Moving on to the third page, see, there's a lot of pages of why it's amazing. There's a message here. A single Starship in orbit has about the same interior volume as the entire ISS. It's being developed entirely or almost entirely with private funds. There's a little tiny bit of Air Force money at one point. It's really being developed transparently. I think we have a really good idea of where they are in their development. Certainly far better than we actually know very little about the real status of New Glenn. I mean, we know something, but compared to Starship, we don't know anything. And the last thing I want to leave you with in terms of why this is a big deal, and I only found this recently, but the design target for Starship Super Heavy is that 10 Starships and Super Heavies should be able to launch 1 million metric tons per year. And that's with 3 flights per day about. But the point is they're designing for that, but just wrap your mind around it, because 10 ships, that's not that many, right? We got a lot of ocean tankers and things like that. 1 million metric tons per year is a revolution, a quantum leap forward in space beyond anything we've ever even really thought about. So let's take a look at the eye chart for this. I'm going to compare Starship Super Heavy over here to SLS Block 1 and SLS Block 1B, because that's what people always want to know about. So Starship, definitely taller, but height doesn't really mean that much. It just means it's a big rocket. They're all big rockets. Liftoff thrust, it definitely means something. 72 meganewtons, it's like twice as much liftoff thrust. It's not a small difference. It's a very large difference. The 9-meter diameter, 22-foot tall cargo area, that definitely wins. 100 metric tons to LEO. Now you'd say, wait a minute, that vessel is Block 1B over there. That's 105. That's expendable. If you expended the Starship Super Heavy, you would see a lot more than 100 metric tons. That's 100 metric tons reusable, which is a huge payload. Moving on, with refueling, you can get 100 metric tons to Geo, and you can get 100 metric tons to the moon. So that's like, you know, it's going to win out. In terms of availability, here's the thing. I mean, this is to some extent depends on how much you think Elon exaggerates. But I'm going more by what you can see with your eyes in terms of progress. I think it's extremely likely that they'll launch a full Starship Super Heavy to orbit either later this year or early next year, which is pretty much about the time SLS Block 1 is going to launch. It's even possible to make orbit before SLS Block 1. Or might reach it just after, but it is coming. They're actually very close. And we'll get to this, but after SN11 flies, which is the next Starship, they're going to roll a Super Heavy out to the pad to start testing that. And of course, that'll be just like what they call cryo-proof tests. They'll fuel it up and I test all the ground support equipment and everything. And then they'll pretty soon they'll roll out the whole thing and fly it. It'll take a while, but it's coming. Reusability, no question. Starships, you know, everything beats nothing all the time. So look, you notice here that there's a lot of red in the Starship column, and I think it speaks for itself. In terms of like lunar surface missions, this slide is intended to give you an idea of what the general flight path is, and I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. Unfortunately, I don't even see my cursor that well. I went with a black cursor. But basically, you'll put the vehicle in an elliptic orbit, and then you'll refuel it periodically with additional tankers. And then when it's ready, it'll head out to the translunar injection. It'll actually land on the moon. It'll have enough fuel that it'll be able to come back and land on Earth without further refueling. So that's a pretty amazing thing. And that's what you get with orbital refueling. You can't do that without orbital refueling. So, a thought experiment. So some people think, you know, this is great, Dale and all, but I think it's just a bridge too far. It's not going to work. It's too complicated, too risky. You know, something's going to happen. Like, let's say the heat shield doesn't work, so you can't reuse the second stage. And let's say that in-space refueling, that doesn't work either. I don't know. It doesn't work for some reason. Even with these caveats, Starship Super Heavy will handily beat the New Glenn. They'll have 100 metric tons to LEO versus 45 with a reusable first stage. It's basically twice the capacity of New Glenn. They'll have a 9-meter fairing versus a 7-meter fairing, and almost certainly similar or lower costs. So New Glenn kind of has a problem. It's going to be competitive with the Falcon Heavy. It's not going to be so competitive with Starship Super Heavy. And if we add in-space refueling, but you still can't reuse the second stage, you can get 100 metric tons to the moon and Mars. Now, that's not going to be cheap enough probably to build a city on Mars, but it's going to be a dramatic change in terms of supporting a base on the moon and doing a lot of other things in space. So, conclusion. I guess I'm actually a little bit early here. Hopefully we'll have a lot of questions. It's really exciting, okay? It's really this amazing time to be alive. The Russians are on a path to not being serious players. You notice I didn't talk much about the Russians, and that's because when you sit down and you look at what they're doing, it's just not very interesting. They're low on money, and it's sad, but they're not really competitive anymore. Chinese coming on strong. They're not competitive yet, but they are putting in a lot of money. And I didn't focus too much on what they're doing because a lot of it's in a fairly early stage. But I think it's reasonable to suppose that, you know, certainly over the next 5 years, they're going to become stronger and stronger in space. And I'm talking here about launch vehicles. They're working on reusable methane LOX vehicles that are basically sort of the Chinese version of the Falcon 9. and you know, they're coming. Europe is lagging, as I said. The Ariane 6, they sat down and they said, how can we be just a little bit more expensive on a Falcon 9 and you know, that's ways be competitive, be a lot cheaper than the Ariane 5. And they succeeded. I don't think there's any question Ariane 6 met its goals. It just turns out to be not very competitive against even the Falcon 9 or the Falcon Heavy. And against the Starship, it's totally and absolutely uncompetitive. So they have already started to build methane oxygen engine. The program is called Prometheus, and you're going to be hearing more about that. My expectation is that the Ariane 6 will fly for a couple of years, and then before you know it, it'll be replaced by an Ariane 7 that'll have some kind of reusability. But they're definitely, they got to really work to come back at this point. As I've hinted here, New Glenn and Vulcan and Ariane 6 targeted Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy. They're not going to compete with those vehicles. They're going to compete with Starship Super Heavy. But no matter what happens exactly, these exciting choices will enable a new age of lunar exploration and development. It will be more feasible to go to the moon than ever, cheaper than ever, and with larger cargoes. It's extremely exciting. But there's a little bit more. So, as we speak at this moment, Starship SN11 sits on the pad in Boca Chica, Florida. And the launch date no earlier than March 26th, which is tomorrow. However, I was looking forward to doing this slide, but now it's looking like they're going to do another static fire. They did a static fire earlier in the week, and something didn't go quite right, so they're going to do another one tomorrow. But I expect SN11 to probably launch certainly within a week, and probably soon. Probably just really a few days. And I think I'm wishing them luck that they actually are able to land. But if they can't, you know, there's a whole bunch more Starships in different stages of completion in Boca Chica, and they'll keep flying them until they get it right. So I'm ready for questions. Bert?
Very good. Thank you, Dale. Why don't you stop sharing so we can get you back up on the full screen? There you go. And let me just...
I'm going to have a drink of Coke here.
Oh, that's okay. I think we can let you do that. So we have a number of questions that have come in, but I want to start with one first, just from me, because that was really interesting, and I hadn't even thought about the perspective of SpaceX. I knew they were doing some exciting new things, but this month was the 95th anniversary of Robert Goddard's first flight of the liquid-fueled rocket, March 16th, 1926. So be 5 more years. It's 100 years. You know, when you're looking at these rockets at this point and at the stage of development, you know, maybe this is more of just an impression and maybe of your understanding of the technology. Do you think, you know, where we are today could have been envisioned 95, 100 years ago with rocket technology? It sounds like we're on the cusp of something incredibly new as well.
I think so. I think that if somebody like von Braun or Hermann Oberth or Goddard showed up and you showed them around, they would be impressed by the computers and the additive manufacturing and you know, a lot of the toys we have and the robot that Elon has wandering around Boca Chica. They'd be impressed by all that. But the actual rockets are totally within the scope of things they understood. They're basically Goddard's rocket. There's some kind of fuel, hydrocarbons burning with, you know, with liquid oxygen. And in that sense, you know, it's all the same thing. It's just the details matter, right? The details of the engine design really matter. And but it's not like here's the thing. People underestimate the importance of incremental improvements. I always like to look back in technology history to compare Sony Betamax versus VHS. When they started out, Sony Betamax was far superior to a VHS. And a lot of people wrote them off and said, oh, it's so inferior, Betamax is the future. But the Japanese company that made VHS, they were not deterred. They simply sat down and they started improving it every single year for 10 years until VHS was better than Betamax. And the Betamax people kind of rested on their laurels, and in the end, they lost out completely. So whoever keeps developing the technology is going to win. And Elon's genius. He has a couple of geniuses here, or genius ideas. One is just to keep going. Just don't do something and sit back and admire yourself. Just every day, do something better. Do it better tomorrow. Do it the day after that, the day after that. And that's what you're seeing here. It's Silicon Valley software development methodology applied to rockets. And I think if you've never worked in Silicon Valley or with that kind of startup, you don't really understand what's going on here. Anyway, next question.
Great perspective. I'm going to read a couple that have come in via the Q&A function, and we do have a few people who've raised their hand as well, so we'll try to get them as well. But David asked, could you address the environmental impacts of the different propellant options used by these vehicles?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the first thing I want to say, and look, I have a strong opinion about this, but I'm sort of with Werner von Braun. Von Braun once said that no human being should be launched into space on a solid booster. And the fundamental reason for that is that solid booster is like a firecracker. Once you light it, it goes. There's no throttling, no stopping. You don't get off. It either works or you're dead. And he didn't like that. But they have another problem. These SRBs that are used on the SLS and all the other ones, they generate perchlorates, which are thyroid poisons. And the usual way this is justified is, well, there aren't very many of them, so who cares? Well, that's great. When you're launching one SLS per year, maybe it doesn't matter. But if you started launching any meaningful number of them, it would be a huge pollution issue. So I think in order to develop space, you have to have a rocket that you can fly all the time and will not cause environmental problems. So that's a big problem. Of course, if you use hydrogen and oxygen, the advantage of that is that the exhaust is water. However, I would caution you against thinking that it has no polluting effect at all, because it's actually a little unclear what depositing a lot of water in the upper atmosphere would really do. The advantage of methane, and I'm not even going to talk about RP1 because I think everybody's going to methane oxygen, is it burns a lot cleaner than RP1 oxygen. It cokes the engine less and generates less carbon dioxide and so on. But you can make, and it is my understanding, Musk intends to make his use of methane carbon neutral, because he's planning on manufacturing methane out of the Martian atmosphere. You can do the same thing on Earth too. And people are looking at this, I think a lot more actively than they were at one point. So there's nothing that says that you have to be, you can't be carbon neutral with a methane oxygen engine. And then I think you'll find that at some point he's going to make Starship totally carbon neutral. So I think the other perspective on this is that even if you launch 3 Starships a day for a year, this is just absolutely insignificant compared to all the automobiles and jet planes and everything else that's going on. So it's like such a tiny fraction. It doesn't matter that much. Next, what's next?
Very good. I think you've answered this, but I'll ask it anyway. Jeff is asking about the Russian Proton rockets. You said they're not a player already. Anything additional to add?
Sorry, not really. I think they've had a lot of reliability issues, and they're still flying. But Russia is moving on to the Angra rockets from the Proton. So that's sort of another talk. But I honestly, it's not that interesting because they're so far behind in everything they're doing.
Very good. I'll go on to the next question. Daniel actually brings up another country. You did not mention India. They are doing a great job on shoestring budget. They have orbited Mars the first try. Why are they not competitive for moon missions?
I think they're just not building big enough rockets yet. They're in an earlier stage of development, And they're just now sort of getting around to the idea of doing a Mercury-style orbital mission. And that puts them way back there somewhere. I think if they continue to spend money, they're going to end up doing something interesting. I think they're just not at the same level. That's all. It's not a cut on them or anything. They're doing wonderful things at a low budget, but they're just catching up, and they'll be catching up for a while yet.
Right. This one actually takes the question to Mars. Do you think SpaceX is the leader right now in rocket development to get to Mars?
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question. Look, the thing about the NASA plan, and I'm not saying the NASA plan is bad. I think their current plan, building the gateway and having the gateway be a prototype for an actual interplanetary transport that then goes to Mars with ion engines. It's a totally rational plan given the limitations of the SLS, which are many, and all the other limitations they're working under. It's just that if you have a Starship Super Heavy, you don't need any of that. You just fly to Mars. It's a completely different game.
Very good. I didn't mention the two people who asked. The question previously was from Daniel, and this one was from Doug. I'm going to take one more question from the Q&A, and then we'll open it up to the mic. Let's see. This one is from Michael. What are your thoughts about the Russians hoping to beat Starship with nuclear rocket engines? Okay, that's a different take on things.
I guess I don't think it's very likely, and I'll tell you why. I think it's a little difficult to imagine that the Russians are going to fly a nuclear rocket engine inside the atmosphere. If it's a nuclear thermal engine, you're going to have some kind of radioactive exhaust to some degree, and I really find it hard to imagine you're going to have, 3 of those launching every day trying to compete with Starship. I'm not saying they can't build it. They're very clever folks. They may build something for use in space. That makes sense. I think that's very interesting. So I think the question maybe is, how does a nuclear thermal rocket compete with Starship going to Mars? And I think there's also people in the U.S. at Marshall Space Flight Center working on a nuclear thermal rocket. And nuclear thermal rockets, definitely get to Mars faster. So it's kind of a trade-off. I think it's really good they're working on it, and I think we should do more development of nuclear thermal rockets. And certainly, as we expand into space, we're going to need, nuclear power generation and nuclear rockets, at some point. I think the challenge always is what's politically the easiest to do. And it's also the Russians, maybe it is politically easier because they're less concerned perhaps about, shall we say, collateral damage from nuclear rockets. In the U.S., I think it'd be really difficult to get any kind of meaningful amount of nuclear rockets launched or carrying any meaningful amount of cargo. I don't know. I think right now it doesn't look terribly favorable. It's also a question of, okay, when do you think Starship could get to Mars? Well, 2024 maybe, 2026, 2028. That's long before anybody's going to go anywhere doing. If you could do one test of a nuclear rocket in space by 2028, I would be amazed.
Very good. Thank you, Dale. What I want to do is open it up to a speaker. I'm going to allow Carl to speak. Carl has asked questions before, so Carl, I'm going to turn on your mic. Okay, and you're muted right now, Carl, so make sure you unmute. There you go. There you go. We can hear you. Go ask your question.
Okay. Hello, Dale. Hey, I want to say that this was quite an informative, interesting kind of presentation you made. I have to say that. And I love that background behind you, that settlement. But in the meantime, my question is, considering all the money going for the COVID and for the immigration program, how do you think that might impact on NASA's budget?
Well, okay, so there's 2 things I'll say to that. There's actually a lot of political support for NASA's budget, so I don't particularly expect big cuts. If you look at what President Biden has said, he's been supportive of Artemis, he's been supportive of Commercial Crew, he's even been supportive of Space Force. So there may be some cuts or some reallocations, but they're modest. And in a way, NASA's size, which is small, I mean, we're talking about trillion-dollar infrastructure bills, trillion-dollar COVID relief bills, and NASA's budget is like $22 billion. It's like a rounding error in there somewhere. It's just insignificant. So that, yeah, something might get cut, but I'm not too worried about it. I know that people are worried because there could be a 10% cut, and that would cause a lot of pain. And I know that people in Congress are worried about it because I've been talking to them over the last week or two. I've been in like five or so meetings with staffers, and you know, they're just worried. I mean, they don't want to commit to anything until they know what the budget's going to be. But fundamentally, there's a lot of support in the Congress to keep doing what NASA's doing, and I wouldn't worry too much about it. The other thing I want to say is that the beauty of Elon Musk's Mars program is that it really isn't about the NASA budget. Elon isn't spending NASA's money. He's spending his investors' money, of which he has a good bit because, you know, they've given him a lot of money. But the beauty of Starship is it'll pay for itself. And he's going to use it to launch Starlinks. And he's going to use Starlink to make money and launch more Starlinks. And, you know, he's going to perfect Starship launching Starlinks. And I was going to say earlier, the genius, one of the other genius aspects of what Musk does is I can't recall virtually anybody I'm familiar with who's so good at getting his customers to pay for testing. I mean, basically, he got NASA and a whole bunch of other commercial companies to pay for testing a reusable first stage. All he had to do was to guarantee that that stage would actually launch to orbit, and then he got to test the reusability. He's going to do the same thing with Starship and second stage reuse. He's going to launch it, and he's going to burn, he's going to try to land it. And a lot of those second stages are going to fail. They're going to burn up, they're going to blow up, and you'll see all kinds of articles about what an idiot Musk is, blah, blah, blah. And then one day it'll work. And then you won't see any more articles about what an idiot he is. Over.
Okay, thank you, Dale.
Very good. Thanks, Carl. I'm going to put you back on mute here. Okay. Very good. I'll take a few more questions that have come in through Q&A. We've got quite a few, Dale, so we'll keep you busy tonight. This one I'll try to do from a more less political perspective because I know it could be controversial to answer, but Daniel is asking about the future of the SLS. Does it have a future?
Well, the thing I'll say is that SLS has enormous political support, and I think it's easy for people who aren't steeped in the space politics to look at SLS and say, well, why are they doing that? It costs a lot of money, and they fly it once a year. It's big, it's expensive. It's based on technology from like 1980, for heaven's sakes. And so why are we doing this? The reason is that it is the genius of Lyndon Johnson. By the way, is the genius that keeps NASA going, of putting NASA centers in these key presidential states and then spreading all the work out over not just the NASA centers, but all the other 50 states. So when you try to go in and cut a program like SLS, it's like running into a buzzsaw, and you do not come out of that experience. So it's not very likely to be cut anytime soon. But at the same time, and of course, it's also easy to say, well, Musk may slip on a banana peel or something like that, and the whole thing Starship thing could just stop. It might happen. So we'll have to wait and see. But I think it at some point, if things like New Glenn and SLS Starship continue to be developed commercially, there will have to come a time when people look and say, this SLS thing, it's nice and all, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't think we're quite there yet. And I encourage you to read the NSS blog, which is great. You should all read it, subscribe to it. I've written a couple of blog posts about the topic of when would the most conservative space planner decide to drop SLS? And, to try to help educate about, what would really be needed to convince the most skeptical. And you got to remember, there's a lot of people in NASA and all that. They've seen people come around with view graphs saying they have this great rocket, and then the rocket never appeared. So it's a bit of a show me situation. And as a result, NASA often seems to be sort of driving, looking at it at the rear view mirror like this. But they have a reason for their conservatism. So I encourage you to check out the NSS blog. Over.
Very good. And we've got another question from Jeff, and this is one that I guess I'm wondering about. And I know that says that Dave Dresser would also like to maybe answer this question if he could. But, how is a stainless steel rocket going to be able to re-enter safely? What's the thermal protection system they're planning to use for Starship?
Okay, so that's a good question, and that's one of the many details on the cutting room floor of this talk. Like I say, I mean, probably every aspect of Starship, the engines, the thermal protection system, the aero surface design, they all could be a long talk by themselves. I think one thing people do not or should keep in mind is that SpaceX, first off, understands thermal protection. I mean, they created something called the Pica X, which is the ablative surface on the bottom of the Dragon capsule. And they have a lot of experience flying that capsule back from space. And so they kind of understand a little bit about heat shields. And they are developing some kind of new heat shield. That's all we really know about it. And they're testing it. They actually, if you look closely at all the Starship flights, you'll see that they have experimental heat tiles on them. And the idea is the sort of the bottom half of the Starship will be covered with tiles, but they're not going to be like the shuttle tiles. They're much stronger. And precisely what they are is not totally known. It may well be proprietary, and but they're certainly going to be the whole bottom half. If you look at a picture of a rendering of a Starship, usually the top half is shiny and the bottom half is black. The black is because they have some kind of tiles on them to protect it. And I think what they're testing right now, if you look closely at the pictures of Starship, you'll see a lot of little pointy things sticking up, and those are rods that onto which you attach the tiles, and then they put kind of a filler between the tiles. And you can expect this is going to go on for a while. I think this is one thing that the traditional aerospace engineers have trouble with. I'm not sure that Elon knows, even right now, exactly how the heat shield is going to work. What he knows is he's going to fly heat shields and test them until it does work. And I'm also reminded of Edison, who I want to say it was, he mentioned, somebody said, well, don't you consider yourself a failure because it took you either 2,000 or 3,000 times to make the electric light bulb work? He says, no, I learned 2,000 ways not to make light bulbs. Next question.
Hey, Dale, I just one more note on that. The beauty of the Starship tiles is they're all standard size. It's not this custom puzzle you have to put together like they do on the shuttle. So it's very inexpensive compared to the shuttle.
Good information.
Yes, totally true.
Yep. Let's see another question from George. How many flights will be necessary to fuel a Starship for a round trip to the moon?
That's actually a subject of quite a bit of speculation among observers. I don't think anybody really knows exactly what SpaceX thinks. And it's also possible it changes. Again, this is a source of frustration. People are looking for sort of exact answers to questions when Elon himself doesn't know the answers to. He doesn't know exactly what it's going to really launch. And if you don't know exactly what it's going to really launch, you don't know exactly how many trips it's going to be. I've seen estimates like four tanker flights to get to the moon, maybe 3, and usually 8 or 9 to get to Mars. So, but And the answer may vary over time. It's the kind of thing where, you know, the first time you do it, it may take more, and the second time it may take less because you've improved the rocket. Next question.
Very good. Fred, you said a couple of questions came in on the chat. I can't find those. Do you have them handy? I just want to make sure we try to cover everybody. Fred?
Bert, I've been answering those as they came in pretty much.
As they come in. Okay, great. Because I didn't want to miss anybody if just to make sure. So just a couple more then that came in with the Q&A. And I guess there are a couple of questions that came in from those who submitted and on, you know, and live about timeframes. So maybe I'll ask two things then, Dale, about, you know, and this would be your estimate. When do you think we'll make it back to the moon? And then people are speculating, well, what about Mars? When do you think that, you know, when's the first attempt?
Yeah. First off, let me say that I don't think anybody thinks the Artemis goal of 2024 will be achieved. It will be somewhat later than 2024. It might be 2025, it might be 2026, something like that. I mean, to make an extrapolation like this involves many considerations, and it's very complex because you have to differentiate between when someone might be capable of doing it and when they might actually make the effort to do it. So I think SpaceX is going to tread carefully, and they're going to avoid upstaging NASA. If Artemis 3 is on the pad, they may well wait with Dear Moon until after Artemis 3, just to avoid a kind of unseemly embarrassment or something. Or, you know, anyway, I'm just saying that I don't think, I think Elon is smart, and he's not going to engage in sort of a crazy one-upsmanship here. He's not racing NASA, he's working with NASA. And I also think that NASA has been pretty good about, as things progress, they sort of see how things are coming and sort of shift direction a little bit. I mean, I think it's pretty amazing that NASA is willing to use a Falcon Heavy to launch the first two parts of the Gateway. I think that's a big step for them to take that. I mean, they've been slow to use the Falcon Heavy, let's say that. And the Air Force has been a lot faster. So it's tough to say. And also you have to differentiate the specific mission. Like, when would SpaceX do a test of the Dear Moon mission? That might actually not be that far off, right? A couple of years. When would they actually land on the moon as a test? Maybe a little bit more. Also depends if SpaceX gets a contract for the human landers. As you may or may not have heard, there are 3 teams competing to build commercial human landers for Artemis. SpaceX with basically a Starship-derived lunar lander, Dynetics with a really interesting drop tank architecture, and what the self-appointed national team, which consists of Blue Origin, Lockheed, and a couple of other companies, with a 3-part lander. You know, to some extent, it's going to depend. If SpaceX actually gets that contract, which we'll know in I think very soon, probably, then it's more likely that you'll see them landing on the moon because they'll need to test it. And if they don't, then they may have other priorities. So it's really complicated. One thing I will say is when people start talking about, wow, we're gonna land on Mars in 2030 or 2040, I don't believe any of that. I think you're gonna see SpaceX land on Mars within the next 10 years. Not necessarily with crew, but they'll land on Mars within the next 10 years. And I also think you're gonna see SpaceX team up with NASA. You know, right now they're doing what they call Transporter 1, Transporter 2. They're doing these ride shares to LEO. I think they're gonna have a ride share to the moon and a ride share to Mars. And they're just gonna, get together with a lot of people and say, look, we're taking 100 million tons to Mars. Well, what do you want to put on the ship? And they'll work it out, and it'll be risky, and some of them will be lost, but some of them will fly with 1 or 2 things in them. But there will be I think the people at NASA would love to go to Mars cheaply, right? I mean, and if it becomes possible, they're going to take advantage of Starship to do it. Next question.
I think that will do it, Dale. We've run up to our time limit. I do apologize for those that have put a few questions in the queue, and maybe we'll try to reach out to you. But on behalf of all of us, I just want to thank you for, wow, what a very informative, fun, interesting presentation. And as you said, there are things you could come back and talk about. So certainly we'll extend that invitation to you to come back again sometime soon and talk about some of the other technologies and some of the other things that are happening related to space exploration and space development. If that sounds good to you, I think we have an in with you, right? Maybe we'll get you out of your SOO position and out there presenting. That'll be great. So again, Dale, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I do want to express my thanks also to Larry Ahern, as Vice President of Chapters, for all his teamwork and make sure we get these space forums and town halls organized, and Fred Becker, and who as always does a great job managing the technology, and Dave Dressler. So it's been a really fun evening, and let me just share my screen one more time, everybody, as we close out. And again, Dale, thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you to everybody tonight for joining us, and those of you who are in different time zones, a good morning, I guess. So we'll say have a great evening, a great day, and a great weekend. Wishing everybody to stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks for the discussion with Scott Pace, and again, Greg Autry will be moderating that. So look for the invite, look for the messaging about the recording for this event tonight. And again, thank you all. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay